Hello and welcome to the course of world history. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today we are looking at the rise of communism. Our essential question is, how did communism triumph over moderate socialism in Russia? So let's look at communist struggles. During the Russian Civil War, which broke out after the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, the tail end of World War One, Russia is in a phase of war communism. And this war communism is not treating the people so well. In war communism, the government seizes all the grain from farms to make sure that the army is fed. The army must survive for the communist government to survive, and that means they need the food. And so we see starvation. We can see the swollen belly as a sign of starvation out amongst the peasants. The peasants are dying. In fact, they're dying, so they have to fight back against the communist system. They begin to hoard the grain, hide the grain, dig holes in the ground, bury the grain so that when the army came by, it wasn't there. This is an attack on the communist system, but really just designed so that they could survive. But despite these efforts, when a bad harvest comes in because of a drought, we wind up seeing 5 million Russians die in a single year. Trotsky, this fellow right here, by many accounts, the second most important person in the party at that time, was quoted as saying that the country and the government with it were at the very edge of the abyss. So how do they pull back? They pull back because of Lenin's new economic policy. He abandoned the extreme war of communism in favor of this new economic policy. What was it? Well, it was a moderate form of communism, more like a strong socialism. In this moderate communism, peasants are allowed to sell their crops openly. Okay, no more government seizures. It's peasants selling their crops at the prices determined by the peasants. They also allow the private ownership of small businesses. Anything that was less than 20 employees could be owned privately, but larger companies still remained state-owned. Now, this economic change regained support for the government. The people come around to supporting the government again, and that helps the economy itself to recover. So the Russian economy is doing much better going into the late 1920s. 1922, the Soviet Union is created. Lenin formally creates this new state. It's called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It's abbreviated the USSR. You'll mostly hear me use the abbreviation the Soviet Union. Now, this union brings together 6 nations by the end of 1922, collectivizing them together into one new state. And this idea spread so that by 1940 there are 15 Soviet nations in the Soviet Union. This new nation was, without any doubt, led by the Communist Party in Moscow. The Russians were in charge of the Soviet Union, but there were benefits to these other countries joining. It was at its max, it was the second largest contiguous state in world history. The only other contiguous state that is all within one border, larger than this, was the Mongol Empire. But if you include the British Empire at its peak, when it controlled Canada, Australia, India, huge chunks of Africa, that would be the largest empire in world history. But this is by no doubt a massive chunk of land that spreads across Eastern Europe and all of Northern Asia. All right, so the Soviet Union enters into a troubled time after Lenin dies in 1924, just 2 years into the Soviet era. The power struggle erupts in the Politburo. The Politburo are the top members of the Communist Party in Russia. There were 8, but now that Lenin has died, there are 7 remaining members. And they're in this power struggle to find out who is going to be in charge of the Soviet Union. Now, there is a faction that's led by Leon Trotsky that is really pushing for reversing the new economic policy of Lenin. Lenin had moved away from extreme communism. Trotsky wanted to go back to it. And he had some support from others. One of his supporters was Stalin for the idea, but Stalin didn't support Trotsky as the leader. Trotsky's faction is going to win this debate, and they will move toward extreme communism again, but Trotsky doesn't get to be the leader. He had been Lenin's number two, but he will not be Lenin's successor. Stalin will be the man who winds up taking charge. Stalin was a member of the Politburo. He was a member of one of those 8 top people. And he was also the general secretary of the Communist Party. Now, this was not a glamorous job, but he was able to use his position to appoint party members to government jobs, which means that thousands of district, city, and town officials within the Communist Party were handpicked by Stalin. And when Lenin dies, it's the party that picks a new leader. He's now elevated all of these people who are going to support his leadership of the Communist Party in Russia. So Stalin winds up being the guy. Trotsky is forced out of the Soviet Union, out of the party. He is exiled from Russia itself. And on the order of Stalin, when Stalin feared that Trotsky might try to come back, Trotsky was murdered while in exile in Mexico City in 1940. Stalin is now firmly in charge. I'll actually go back a moment. This right here shows all the other Politburo members. Trotsky murdered. He was executed, died by suicide. Stalin's going to go to town on his own people. All right. So the 5-year plans. The Stalin era, the Stalinist period of Russian history, brought as big of a revolution to the country as the Bolshevik Revolution had. And it begins in 1928 with what he calls the first 5-year plan. And there will be a lot of 5-year plans. But the 5-year plan was a 5-year goal-setting mission to transform the economy. And the first one focused on shifting from an agricultural-based economy to an industrial one. We're going to stop being known for growing things, and we're going to start being known for making them. And in the 5 years, this goal is achieved. Russia quadruples the production of heavy machinery, making machines that make machines, making the big industrial stuff. And they also double their oil production during this time. The economy in these regards is doing much better, but there are social costs to this. This shift to industrialism requires labor, so people are moved forcefully from the countryside into the cities. But the problem is the cities didn't have houses for them. So we wind up having several families crammed into a single small apartment. And the conditions deteriorate quickly. It's disease-ridden, malnourished, cramped, uncomfortable, and nobody was allowed to move out. You couldn't choose to live outside and commute in. That wasn't an option. You had to live in the city. We are industrialized now. 26 million private farms are seized by the government. Remember the new economic policy had allowed private farms to continue? Stalin ends that. No more private farms. Instead, these farms are collectivized into 250,000 government-owned farms. And the peasants who used to own the farm are now just an employee on the government farm. Problem is, this is very inefficient. When people work and they know that they will benefit financially from the product of their work, they produce more. When they don't feel the incentive to work hard, to produce more, they do not. This is the heart of why communism fails. Inefficiencies in this system and the shift of the population from the farms to the cities leads to a famine that kills 10 million people in 1 year alone, the famine of 1932 to 1933. And by some estimates, all the famines of the early Soviet era account for about 20 million deaths. Political deaths are also happening. Stalin's policies make him very unpopular, but no institution could remove him. They couldn't remove him because he had strengthened his control of the Communist Party to such a level that there was nobody left. In the Great Purge, Stalin had all of the old Bolsheviks and their allies arrested. We mentioned before the Politburo, but it went deeper than that. This is all of Lenin's general staff in 1917 when they first took control. These were all the top people, and every single one of them is executed or murdered, except for Stalin. He's the last man standing. From 1936 to 1938, it goes even beyond that. In the Great Purge, 8 million people are arrested. Many are sent to labor camps in Siberia. These were camps designed to work people to death, to accomplish some goal before they die, but life expectancy there is not very long. This is a death sentence. It's just a death sentence through exhaustion and starvation. All right. Soviet Russia. Kind of a rough start for them. That was it for today. I do hope you learned something and enjoyed this lesson. I will see you next time. Farewell.